Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Louisiana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The early morning fog still clung to the cypress trees of Bayou Noir when Sheriff Thomas Wilcox discovered the first body. It was June 17, 1835, and the swamps of St. Martin Parish had been unusually quiet that spring. The plantation owner, Edwin Montgomery, had been found face down in the shallow waters at the edge of his property, his back bearing what appeared to be hunting wounds. What perplexed the authorities wasn't just the precision of these wounds, but the careful arrangement of the body, positioned to face his own plantation house across the water, as if forced to watch it in his final moments. The morning birds had fallen silent, as though they too sensed the unnatural stillness that had settled over the scene. Montgomery's death might have been attributed to the dangers of the swampland, or even to the frequent territorial disputes among landowners, had it not been for the curious object found clutched in his right hand. A small carved figurine of cypress wood, shaped like a boat, with the initials S.B. scorched into its base. The figurine matched no known craftsman's work in the parish, and its presence transformed what might have been a tragic accident into something the local newspaper would later describe as a calculated message of unmistakable intent. Sheriff Wilcox, a man known for his pragmatic approach to law enforcement, found himself unsettled by the deliberate positioning of the body and the mysterious carving it held. The records from St. Martin Parish Courthouse, preserved on microfilm and discovered during a cataloging project in 1965, contain the first official documentation of what would become known locally as the Shadow of Bayou Noir. The death of Edwin Montgomery marked only the beginning of a series of events that would cast a long shadow over the Louisiana swamplands for generations to come. The official report, written in the careful script of a court clerk attempting to remain objective, nevertheless betrays a sense of unease in its unusually detailed description of the scene and the unnatural calm that seemed to have descended upon the area. According to the parish records, the Montgomery plantation, Belle Crescent, was known for its profitable sugarcane harvests and the harsh conditions endured by those enslaved there. Edwin Montgomery had inherited the plantation from his father in 1829, and under his management, Belle Crescent had expanded significantly. The plantation's production had nearly doubled in 5 years, an achievement that had earned Montgomery recognition among his peers but had come at a tremendous human cost. What the official records failed to mention, but was later revealed through the discovered journal of Montgomery's housekeeper, Sarah Beaumont, was the particular cruelty that characterized his treatment of the people he enslaved. Mr. Montgomery takes a scientific approach to punishment, she wrote in an entry dated November 1833, the ink blotched in places as though her hand had trembled while writing. He speaks of breaking men's spirits as though discussing how to break wild horses. The screams from the back fields have become so commonplace that I no longer notice them until they stop. Yesterday, a man was punished for looking directly at the master during dinner service. I observed Mr. Montgomery watching the proceedings with an expression I can only describe as satisfaction, as though witnessing the confirmation of some private theory. The journal makes repeated references to a man known only as Solomon, described as uncommonly tall and silent, with eyes that seemed to absorb everything and reveal nothing. According to Beaumont's writings, Solomon had been purchased by Montgomery in 1830 from a plantation in Mississippi. What distinguished him, beyond his imposing physical presence, was his knowledge of the swamplands. Solomon knows the bayou better than those born to it, Beaumont wrote. Mr. Montgomery uses him as a guide when hunting, though I've noticed Solomon watches the master more closely than he watches for game. There is something in his gaze that unnerves me, not hostility exactly, but a quality of assessment, as though calculating distances or measuring weights. When he speaks, which is rarely, his voice has a cadence unlike others I have heard, with words chosen with unusual precision. An entry from spring 1834 describes an incident that seems to have marked a turning point in the relationship between Montgomery and Solomon. "The hunting party returned early today," Beaumont wrote, Mr. Montgomery in a state of unusual agitation. "I gathered from the fragments of conversation among the overseers that they had become separated from Solomon in a remote section of the swamp and spent several hours attempting to find their way back to familiar territory. When they finally emerged, they found Solomon waiting at the edge of the property, having returned by some path unknown to them. Montgomery ordered him flogged for deliberate misdirection, though I noted he seemed more disturbed by Solomon's calm acceptance of the punishment than reassured by it. In the weeks preceding Montgomery's death, there had been tension at Belle Crescent. 3 enslaved men had escaped, disappearing into the swamp despite the dogs and search parties sent after them. Montgomery had been furious, particularly because one of the escaped men was Solomon, who knew the waterways well enough to potentially lead others to freedom. According to the overseer's log, recovered in the 1950s from the ruins of the old plantation office, Montgomery had personally led several expeditions into the swamp to recapture the escaped men, returning each time increasingly agitated and empty-handed. The log entries become progressively more erratic, with the usual methodical documentation giving way to frustrated notations about misleading trails and unnatural silence in sections of the swamp where bird and insect sounds should have been abundant. The last entry in Sarah Beaumont's journal, dated June 15, 1835, just 2 days before Montgomery's body was discovered, reads, "Mr. Montgomery returned from the swamp today in a state I've never witnessed before. His clothing was torn and muddied, his hands scratched from briars. He spoke of eyes watching him from the darkness, of someone or something stalking him among the cypress trees. He's learning," he repeated, though when I asked who he meant, he looked at me as though surprised to find me there. He has ordered additional guards around the property and sleeps with a pistol beneath his pillow. I fear his mind may be affected by the heat and his obsession with recapturing Solomon. There was a small carved figure on the back steps this morning, a man in a boat. I disposed of it before the master could see it, though I cannot say why I felt compelled to do so. The story of Solomon and the events that followed Montgomery's death would have likely been lost to history, relegated to local folklore, had it not been for the discovery made in 1962 by Dr. James Thornton, a historian researching the oral traditions of formerly enslaved people in Louisiana. Thornton uncovered a collection of narratives recorded by a Federal Writers Project interviewer in 1937, including the testimony of Elijah Watson, who claimed to be the grandson of a man who had worked at Belle Crescent. Watson, then in his 80s, had a precision of memory that impressed the interviewer, recalling names and events with remarkable clarity despite the passage of time. According to Watson's account, Solomon had not merely escaped, he had transformed. "My granddaddy told me that Solomon wasn't running from nothing," Watson recounted, his voice on the recorded interview steady and deliberate. He was studying, learning. The swamp taught him patience, taught him how to hunt, how to wait. The master thought he was chasing Solomon, but Solomon was leading him deeper and deeper into places where the rules of men didn't matter no more, where the water can rise in the night without rain, where paths appear and disappear with the changing light. My granddaddy said Solomon could move through water without leaving a wake, could stand so still that birds would perch on his shoulders, thinking him part of the trees. He learned the swamp's secrets, and in return, the swamp hid him from those who meant him harm. Watson's testimony includes detailed descriptions of techniques Solomon allegedly developed for surviving in the swampland, methods for finding food, purifying water, navigating by stars and moss patterns, and most significantly, for using the natural features of the bayou to confuse and misdirect pursuers. Solomon taught others that the swamp wasn't something to fear, Watson said. It was something to understand. Those who respected it found sanctuary. Those who tried to conquer it found only confusion and danger. The plantation records show that in the months following Montgomery's death, Belle Crescent began to unravel. The new owner, Montgomery's cousin William Barrett, arrived from Charleston to take possession of the property, bringing with him modern management ideas and a reputation for even greater cruelty. The initial entries in the plantation ledger after Barrett's arrival show an attempt to impose strict order through what he termed rational methods of control. Yet, according to the parish records, Barrett's tenure at Belle Crescent would be short-lived and marked by growing paranoia. The Barrett letters, preserved in the family collection and made public in 1958, reveal a man increasingly consumed by fear. "Something watches the house from the edge of the swamp," he wrote to his brother in August 1835, the handwriting becoming more urgent and less controlled as the letter progressed. The overseers insist it is merely a runaway, this man Solomon, whom my cousin failed to recapture, but I am convinced there is something more sinister at work here. The dogs refuse to track near the eastern marsh, and 3 of my men have disappeared while patrolling the property line. Last night I heard a whistling from beyond the fields, not a bird call or the wind through the reeds, but something deliberate and patterned. When I mentioned it at breakfast, none of the house servants would meet my eye. They know something they will not speak of. Barrett's letters describe a growing sense of being hunted. He wrote of finding small carved cypress figurines placed at the threshold of the main house, of hearing whistling sounds in the night that the house servants refused to acknowledge or explain, and most disturbingly, of discovering the hunting traps he had set in the swamp, triggered but repurposed, arranged in ways that suggested they were now meant for human prey. "I found one of my own steel traps yesterday," he wrote in September, "set at the exact height of a man's knee along a path I often take to inspect the eastern fields. It had been carefully concealed with leaves, yet placed in a position where the sunlight would reveal it to an observant eye. A warning, not an attempt to injure. More troubling still was what had been placed within it. A small carving of a man with a trap at his feet. The craftsmanship was remarkable in its detail. The face carved upon the figure was unmistakably my own." Local newspaper accounts from the Attakapas Gazette, microfilmed and archived in the Louisiana State University collection, mention growing unrest at Belle Crescent throughout the summer and fall of 1835. An article dated September 4, 1835, reports, "Mr. Barrett of Belle Crescent Plantation has offered a considerable reward for information leading to the capture of several fugitives believed to be hiding in the swamplands bordering his property. Sources close to the plantation suggest that Mr. Barrett's concern extends beyond the economic loss, as there have been numerous unexplained occurrences on the property attributed to these individuals. The most recent incident involved the discovery of elaborate markings carved into several trees along the property boundary, symbols of unknown meaning that local authorities have dismissed as territorial markings, but which have caused considerable disquiet among the domestic staff. A follow-up article, published 2 weeks later, noted that several neighboring plantations had reported similar occurrences, unexplained sounds in the night, small objects of cypress wood found in significant locations, and, most concerning to the plantation owners, a marked increase in the number of enslaved people attempting to escape, always in the direction of Bayou Noir. There is talk among the more superstitious elements, the article stated with clear disapproval, of a swamp king who offers protection to those who flee. More rational observers suggest that a band of runaways has established a temporary camp in the less accessible regions of the bayou, though none of the search parties has yet succeeded in locating such an encampment. By October, Barrett had hired additional overseers and professional slave catchers with experience in the swamplands. Parish records indicate permits issued for expanded hunting parties, with Barrett himself leading expeditions into the more remote regions of Bayou Noir. The official purpose was listed as recapture of valuable property, but Barrett's private correspondence reveals a more desperate motivation. His letters from this period show increasing isolation, as his obsession with the swamp and its hidden inhabitants began to alienate him from the society of neighboring plantation owners. "I must find this Solomon," he wrote to a former military colleague on October 12th, the paper bearing smudges and water stains, as though written in haste or difficult conditions, not simply to reclaim what is legally mine, but because I am convinced he has become something more dangerous than a mere runaway. The others who have disappeared follow him now. They move through my property at will, despite every measure taken to secure it. I have doubled the guard, installed additional locks and bars, and still I find evidence of their presence. A footprint in the soft earth outside my window. Items moved in my private study. The distinct sense of being observed from just beyond the light of the lamps. Most disturbing of all is the effect this unseen presence has on those still under my control. They move differently, watch me differently. There is an expectancy in their manner, as though they are waiting for something they believe to be inevitable. The colleague's response, also preserved in the collection, expresses concern for Barrett's mental state and suggests that he might benefit from a return to Charleston for a period of rest. Barrett's reply, dated October 29th, rejects this suggestion with unexpected vehemence. "You misunderstand the nature of what I face," he wrote. "This is not a matter of overwrought nerves or tropical fever. I am engaged in a contest of wills with an adversary whose methods I am only beginning to comprehend. To abandon the field now would be to cede not merely property, but the very principle of authority upon which our society depends. I have received information from a source I trust that this Solomon was not born in American territory, but brought directly from the Guinea coast. He carries with him knowledge of a different order, not merely of survival in hostile terrain, but of forms of resistance beyond direct confrontation. I am studied, measured, tested. The swamp itself seems to respond to his direction, revealing and concealing, according to some design I have yet to decipher." What happened next is documented in the official report filed by the St. Martin Parish Sheriff's Office on November 3, 1835. At approximately midnight, a fire was discovered in the main barn of Bell Crescent Plantation. As the overseers and house servants fought to contain the blaze, William Barrett, according to multiple witness accounts, claimed to have seen a figure watching from the edge of the swamp. Against the advice of his overseer, Barrett took his rifle and pursued this figure into the darkness. The report notes that several men attempted to follow, but found themselves disoriented by the unusual density of the fog that had descended over the property despite the heat from the burning structure. Barrett was never seen alive again. The search for Barrett began at first light the following morning. According to the sheriff's report, the search parties encountered unusual difficulties in their efforts to track Barrett's movements into the swamp. Dogs brought to follow his scent would proceed confidently to the edge of the water and then become confused, whining and circling rather than continuing. Experienced guides reported finding trails that seemed to lead in promising directions only to end abruptly or circle back on themselves. Most disturbing were the reports from several search party members of hearing Barrett's voice calling from different directions, sometimes simultaneously, leading some to split from the main group, only to become temporarily lost themselves. Barrett's body was discovered 3 days later, deep in a part of the swamp locals called Le Passage des Ombres, the Passage of Shadows. The location was known to few outside the local Cajun population, who traditionally avoided it due to its treacherous terrain and shifting waterways. Like his cousin before him, Barrett's body bore wounds consistent with hunting techniques, and in his hand was clutched another small cypress figurine, this one carved in the shape of a man, kneeling in prayer or submission. The sheriff's report notes the unusual state of the body. Despite the passage of time and the warm conditions, the deceased showed minimal signs of decomposition. The expression upon the face was not one of fear or pain, as might be expected, but rather of profound shock, as though confronted in his final moments with some revelation beyond expectation or preparation. The investigation that followed was cursory at best. The prevailing theory among local authorities, as recorded in the sheriff's report, was that Barrett had become lost in the swamp and fallen victim to its natural dangers, perhaps attacked by an alligator or wild boar after becoming disoriented. The carved figurine was noted but dismissed as a curio of unknown origin, possibly even carried by Barrett himself. The alternative, that the plantation owner had been systematically hunted and killed by those he had considered property, was too unsettling for official consideration. Yet the report contains a curious addendum, added by Sheriff Wilcox himself. It must be noted, though outside the scope of formal investigation, that no tracks or signs were found surrounding the body, despite the soft condition of the ground. It appeared to all present as though Barrett had been placed rather than fallen where he was found, yet no evidence of how this might have been accomplished could be determined. Yet the events at Belle Crescent did not end with Barrett's death. According to property records, the plantation passed to Barrett's younger brother Richard, who arrived from Charleston in December 1835. Unlike his predecessors, Richard Barrett approached the management of Belle Crescent with caution bordering on superstition. He immediately halted all expeditions into the swamp, withdrew the bounties placed on escaped individuals, and according to household accounts, conducted a survey of conditions among those enslaved at the plantation. These actions were met with skepticism and concern from neighboring plantation owners, who saw in Barrett's approach a dangerous precedent that might undermine the regional economy and social order. The personal diary of Richard Barrett, discovered in a collection of family papers donated to the Charleston Historical Society in 1947, reveals a man attempting to negotiate with forces he only partially understood. "I have made it known among the house staff that I wish to speak with someone who might convey a message to the man they call Solomon," he wrote on January 7, 1836, the first entry after his arrival at Belle Crescent. "I have promised there will be no repercussions, no punishment. I simply wish to establish terms that might allow for peace. The deaths of Edwin and William, whatever their faults, require some resolution beyond mere vengeance and countervengeance. There must be a way to acknowledge what has occurred without perpetuating its cycle." Barrett's diary suggests that his overtures were met with silence, not outright refusal, but a more profound absence of response that he found increasingly unnerving. "They listened to my proposals with perfect politeness," he wrote, "and then continue about their duties as though I had spoken of nothing more consequential than the weather. Yet I sense my words are being transmitted somewhere, to someone. I am being evaluated from afar. This morning I found a small carving on my desk, a bird with wings half extended, as though preparing for flight but not yet committed to departure. The craftsmanship is remarkable, the wood still carrying the faint scent of cypress. I understand it as acknowledgment, though of what precisely remains unclear." Throughout the winter of 1836, a tense quiet settled over Belle Crescent. Richard Barrett implemented reforms that were progressive for the time, though still within the fundamentally brutal framework of slavery. Hours of labor were reduced, food rations increased, and the more sadistic overseers dismissed. Yet according to Barrett's writings, the atmosphere of watchful tension never dissipated. The boundaries of the plantation seemed more permeable, the distinction between the ordered world of fields and houses and the wild domain of the swamp increasingly tenuous. "I feel observed at all times," he wrote in February, "not merely by the house staff or field workers whose scrutiny would be understandable, but by something more distant and calculating. Yesterday I found another of the carved figures on the gallery, this one depicting a house with a single candle in the window. I understand it to be a message, though whether of warning or negotiation I cannot determine. Last night I walked to the edge of the property, to the place where the cultivated land gives way to the first stands of cypress. I spoke aloud, addressing whoever might be listening from beyond the border. I explained my intentions, my desire to break from the practices of my brother and cousin, my willingness to consider terms beyond those conventionally recognized. There was no response but the night sounds of the swamp, yet this morning I found a third carving on the steps leading to the house, two hands extended toward one another, not yet touching. Barrett's diary entries from this period reveal a man increasingly caught between worlds. His correspondence with family members and business associates in Charleston shows growing pressure to return Belle Crescent to a more profitable operational model, with implicit and sometimes explicit criticism of his excessive lenience toward those enslaved there. At the same time, his local standing among neighboring plantation owners deteriorated, with social invitations declining and business partnerships becoming strained. Barrett describes this isolation with surprising equanimity, noting that it has allowed him the freedom to pursue a course dictated by conscience rather than convention. The most revealing document from this period comes not from Barrett's writings, but from a letter written by Dr. Samuel Landry, the parish physician who attended to medical needs at several local plantations. In a private correspondence to a medical colleague in New Orleans, dated March 1836, and discovered among the Landry family papers in 1959, the doctor described the unusual psychological state that had overtaken Belle Crescent. The letter, written with the clinical detachment characteristic of 19th-century medical correspondence, nevertheless conveys a sense of professional fascination with the social dynamics he observed. "I have never witnessed anything quite like the condition at the Barrett plantation," Landry wrote. "The owner himself seems to exist in a state of perpetual vigilance, starting at shadows and interpreting the most innocent occurrences as laden with ominous significance. More striking still is the behavior of those enslaved there. They move with a quiet assurance I have not observed elsewhere, performing their duties with perfect adequacy but nothing beyond, watching the master with expressions that, were I fanciful, I might describe as pitying. It is as though they are aware of some imminent resolution that remains invisible to others." Barrett himself consulted me regarding persistent insomnia, describing dreams in which he finds himself wandering in swamp waters that rise gradually around him, never quite reaching a depth that would threaten drowning, but creating a constant awareness of precarious balance. Landry's letter makes specific mention of rumors circulating among the enslaved population across several plantations, stories of a community forming deep in the swampland, in places inaccessible to those who didn't know the secret paths. When I inquired about recent illnesses or injuries, the usual complaints were notably absent. No reports of flogging wounds requiring treatment. No malnourishment or exhaustion, as I commonly observe on other properties. They speak of a man they call the Cypress King, Landry wrote, who knows the language of the swamp and has established a domain beyond the reach of overseers and slave catchers. I would dismiss such tales as mere wishful fantasy, were it not for the tangible effect they have on the behavior of both the enslaved and their increasingly anxious masters. There is a palpable sense of shifting power, subtle but unmistakable. I have been practicing medicine in this parish for 23 years, and have never observed anything comparable to the current atmosphere. It is as though a storm approaches, visible on the horizon but not yet overhead, and all parties are positioning themselves according to their understanding of what it might bring. The parish records indicate that by April 1836, several neighboring plantations had reported increased numbers of escapes, always in the direction of Bayou Noir. Hunting parties returned unsuccessful, with several reports of men becoming disoriented, equipment mysteriously failing, or supplies vanishing from camps established in the swamp. Dogs trained to track human scent would follow trails confidently to certain points and then become confused or frightened, refusing to proceed further. The Attakapas Gazette published an editorial on April 17th calling for a coordinated response to what it termed the growing crisis of authority in the Bayou territories, suggesting that military assistance might be required to reclaim these lawless regions from those who have temporarily seized control. Richard Barrett, according to his diary, opposed such measures. These fools would set the entire swamp ablaze if they could, he wrote on April 20th, the handwriting notably more agitated than in previous entries. They cannot comprehend that we face not mere runaways, but something far more organized and determined. I have come to believe that Solomon, if that is indeed his true name, has created something unprecedented in those dark waters, a society with its own rules and judgments, watching us as we have always watched them. The carved figures continue to appear at irregular intervals, always in locations that should be inaccessible without being observed. The latest depicts a circle of standing men facing outward, with a small boat approaching from one side. I understand it as a representation of their council, perhaps an indication that my proposals are being considered by some collective authority rather than by Solomon alone. The situation reached its crescendo in May 1836. According to both Barrett's diary and parish records, a coalition of local plantation owners organized a large-scale expedition into the deepest regions of Bayou Noir, against Barrett's explicit advice. Led by Thomas Wilcox, who had by then been elected sheriff and comprised of overseers and professional slave catchers from as far away as Mississippi, the party of 27 men entered the swamp on May 15th, heavily armed and provisioned for an extended campaign. Barrett's diary entry from that day expresses deep misgiving. They march as though to conventional warfare, with firearms and torches and dogs straining at their leads. They cannot understand that they enter a domain where such advantages mean nothing, where the terrain itself has been transformed into a weapon against them, where every path leads where Solomon wishes it to lead, where the water and mist and shifting ground all serve purposes beyond their comprehension. Only 9 returned. The official report, filed by Sheriff Wilcox on May 23rd and preserved in the parish records, provides a carefully sanitized account of the expedition's failure. It speaks of adverse conditions, treacherous terrain, and men lost to the natural dangers of the swampland. There are references to unexpected flooding, to trails that disappeared or doubled back upon themselves, to nights disturbed by unusual sounds of unclear origin, and to a persistent fog that made navigation nearly impossible. What it does not mention, however, but what emerges clearly from the private journal of James Harrington, one of the surviving overseers, discovered among his effects after his death in 1860, is the systematic way in which the expedition was dismantled. We were not exploring the swamp, Harrington wrote, the handwriting becoming increasingly erratic as the account progressed. We were being led through it deeper and deeper by signs so subtle that only our guides recognized them at first. Broken reeds pointing in a certain direction, arrangements of stones that seemed random until viewed from a particular angle. We followed what we believed to be tracks, only to find ourselves moving in circles or separated from the main party. On the 3rd day, we established a camp on what appeared to be solid ground, only to wake at midnight with water seeping into our blankets, not from rain, for the sky was clear, but from some unseen source that caused the water level to rise with unnatural precision, just enough to disturb but not to threaten. In the distance, always just beyond the reach of our lanterns, we heard movement, not the familiar sounds of swamp creatures, but the deliberate motion of beings that wished us to know of their presence while remaining unseen. Harrington's account describes a campaign of psychological warfare more than physical confrontation. They could have killed us at any time, he wrote. That became increasingly clear as the days passed. We would wake to find our weapons missing, or returned, but rendered useless by exposure to the swamp water. Men on watch would be discovered at dawn unconscious but unharmed, unable to recall anything beyond a whistling sound approaching through the darkness. Food supplies were tampered with, not poisoned, but altered in ways that made them unpalatable, seasoned with unfamiliar herbs that caused no harm, but provoked profound discomfort. And always the sense of being observed from just beyond the limits of visibility, of decisions being made about us by presences we could not identify or confront. The breaking point came on the fifth night. According to Harrington, the remaining members of the expedition had established a camp on what appeared to be solid ground, only to wake at midnight to find themselves surrounded by water that had not been there hours before, directed somehow to flow where it had not previously flowed. In the confusion that followed, with men scrambling for higher ground and equipment sinking into the suddenly muddy earth, Harrington described seeing figures moving at the edge of the torchlight, their forms partially obscured by mist and the cypress trees. They were not hiding, he wrote. They wanted us to see them, to understand the position in which we had been placed. Among them stood a man taller than the others, motionless, while his companions moved around him in patterns that seemed choreographed. In his hand he held something that caught the light, one of the carved figurines we had heard about, but dismissed as superstition. The mist seemed to gather around him differently than it did around the others, clinging to his shoulders like a mantle, dispersing and reforming with his slightest movement. When he raised his hand, the others stopped their motion. When he lowered it, they disappeared into the darkness, seemingly absorbed by the swamp itself. By Harrington's account, no direct attack was launched against the expedition. Instead, the mysterious figures disappeared into the darkness, leaving the increasingly panicked men to navigate their way out of the swamp without guides, many of their supplies lost to the unexpected flooding. Over the next 3 days, more men disappeared, not through violence, Harrington insisted, but by choice. His journal describes with growing unease the way in which members of the expedition began to change, becoming silent and watchful, their attention directed increasingly toward the depths of the swamp rather than the path that might lead back to settled lands. Daniels was the first to go, he wrote. He had been unusually quiet since the night of the flood. During his watch, he simply walked into the darkness. We heard no struggle, no call for help. In the morning, we found his boots placed neatly at the edge of the camp, pointing outward. By the final day, I no longer trusted any of the men with me. The swamp had gotten inside them somehow. They looked at me with eyes that no longer recognized my authority. When we finally emerged from the bayou, reduced to 9 from our original 27, I could not say with certainty which of us remained truly loyal to the purpose with which we had begun. Something fundamental had shifted during those days in the water and mist. We had entered as hunters and emerged as witnesses to something none of us could properly articulate. When the 9 survivors emerged from Bayou Noir on May 23rd, they carried with them not captives, but a message. According to Sheriff Wilcox's official report, a package was delivered to Richard Barrett that same evening by one of the returning expedition members. The report does not specify the contents of this package, describing it only as private correspondence. Barrett's diary, however, reveals what was delivered: a carefully drawn map of Bell Crescent Plantation with the main house circled in what appeared to be red clay, and a small cypress carving of a bird in flight. Barrett's diary entry for that night is brief but significant. I have received their answer. The time for negotiation has arrived. Barrett's final diary entry, dated May 24, 1836, reads, I understand now what must be done. They have shown remarkable restraint, all things considered. The map is not a threat, but an invitation to negotiation. I will go alone to the place marked at the edge of the property, near the cypress stand, where Edwin met his end. If I do not return, I have left instructions with my solicitor in New Orleans regarding the dissolution of Bell Crescent and the disposition of its assets. Perhaps this is what I have been moving toward since my arrival. Not the reform of an irredeemable system, but its complete abandonment. I find myself thinking of the story of Pharaoh and the plagues, of how many warnings were given before the final reckoning. My brother and cousin received their warnings and chose to disregard them. I hope I have the wisdom to recognize what they did not. Richard Barrett left Bell Crescent the following morning, according to household records. He took with him no weapons, only a small satchel containing documents. the nature of which would not become clear until decades later. The overseer's log for that day contains a terse entry noting Barrett's departure in the direction of Bayou Noir, unaccompanied, against strong advice. Unlike his brother and cousin before him, Richard Barrett did return from the swamp, though the man who emerged 3 days later was, by all accounts, profoundly changed. The overseer's log from Belle Crescent, one of the few documents to survive the eventual abandonment of the plantation, records that Barrett returned on May 27th and immediately began implementing dramatic changes to the plantation's operations. Work in the fields was suspended. Those who had been held in bondage were gathered in the main yard, where Barrett addressed them briefly before retiring to his study to draft a series of documents. The log entry, written with obvious disapproval, notes that Barrett appeared physically unharmed but considerably altered in demeanor, speaking with unusual intensity and making reference to agreements reached and new understandings, without clarification of these terms. What transpired in the swamp between Barrett and Solomon remains largely unknown. Barrett himself never provided a public account, and his private writings from after the meeting contain only oblique references to terms agreed upon and the new arrangement. One diary entry dated May 28th provides a fleeting glimpse. I was taken blindfolded along paths that seemed to double back and cross water repeatedly. When the covering was removed from my eyes, I found myself in a clearing unlike any I could have imagined existing within the swamp. Dry land raised above the water level, with structures built from cypress and other local materials, arranged with remarkable efficiency and forethought. Solomon himself spoke little at first, allowing others to explain the conditions they had established and their expectations regarding my property. It was clear from the beginning that they held the stronger position, yet there was no cruelty or revenge in their approach, merely a clear-eyed assessment of what was possible and necessary. By the second day, I had come to recognize that what I was witnessing was not merely a refuge, but the beginning of something unprecedented, a community founded on principles directly counter to those I had been raised to accept as natural and inevitable. What is clear from subsequent events is that Barrett began a process of effectively dismantling Belle Crescent as a functioning plantation. Parish records show that throughout June and July of 1836, Barrett sold off equipment, livestock, and portions of land. More significantly, he filed manumission papers for numerous individuals previously enslaved at Belle Crescent, not all at once, which would have attracted too much attention and potential intervention, but in small groups over several weeks. These legal documents, preserved in the parish courthouse and later microfilmed, represent one of the largest voluntary manumissions recorded in Louisiana during this period. The reaction from neighboring plantation owners was swift and hostile. Letters preserved in various family collections reveal a campaign of social ostracism and economic pressure against Barrett. Credit was withdrawn, business partnerships dissolved, and social invitations ceased entirely. The Attakapas Gazette published several editorials condemning what it called Barrett's dangerous folly and warning of the contagion of disorder spreading from Belle Crescent. There were calls for legal intervention, accusations of mental instability, and even veiled threats. A letter from Joseph Thibodeau, owner of a neighboring plantation, to a business associate in New Orleans captures the prevailing sentiment. Barrett has crossed a boundary from which there can be no return. His actions threaten not merely his own interests, but the foundation upon which our entire society rests. There is talk among certain elements of more direct intervention should legal remedies prove inadequate. The situation cannot be allowed to continue, regardless of what measures may be required to address it. Yet Barrett continued his methodical dissolution of the plantation system he had inherited. By August, according to property records, he had sold or transferred ownership of over half the original Belle Crescent lands. The most interesting transactions, noted by historians who examined the records in the 1950s, were several parcels transferred to a Solomon Bayou, a name that appears nowhere else in parish records and was almost certainly a legal fiction created to facilitate the transfer of land to individuals who legally could not own property. These transactions were structured with unusual complexity, involving intermediate ownership by Barrett's solicitor in New Orleans and eventual transfer to the nebulous Bayou entity through a series of legal maneuvers that obscured the ultimate beneficiaries. Throughout this period, Barrett maintained an unusual relationship with the swamp that bordered his diminishing property. According to the household staff ledger, he made regular trips to the edge of Bayou Noir, sometimes returning with small carved figurines similar to those that had been associated with the deaths of his predecessors. Yet, unlike those earlier artifacts, which had been interpreted as threats, Barrett appeared to regard these objects as communications to be studied and sometimes responded to. The ledger records that he began to create his own carvings, cruder in execution but similar in form, which he would leave at designated points along the property boundary. A staff member, identified only as H in the ledger, noted, "The master speaks to the swamp now, and it seems the swamp speaks back. He returns from these exchanges neither fearful nor triumphant, but thoughtful, as though engaged in an ongoing conversation of great complexity." The most detailed account of Barrett's activities during this period comes from the journal of Reverend Thomas Miller, an Episcopal minister who visited Belle Crescent in September 1836, and later wrote about his experiences. Miller's journal, published posthumously in 1865 and largely overlooked until it was rediscovered by historians in 1953, describes a plantation in the process of transformation. Miller had come at the request of Barrett himself, ostensibly to discuss the establishment of a school for those formerly enslaved at Belle Crescent, but, as the journal reveals, also to serve as a potential witness to the unprecedented changes taking place there. I found Mr. Barrett to be a man preoccupied with matters beyond the usual concerns of plantation management, Miller wrote. He spoke at length about what he termed the moral economy of the swamp, and seemed to regard the wilderness beyond his property not as a territory to be claimed or tamed, but as a sovereign entity with which he was engaged in ongoing diplomatic relations. He described to me a system of signals and exchanges that had developed between himself and those living within the swampland, a community whose existence he acknowledged openly, though with the caution of one aware that such acknowledgment might be regarded by others as treasonous. "They have created something remarkable there," he told me, "a society without overseers or masters, where decisions are made collectively and work distributed according to ability rather than compulsion. I have been permitted to observe but not to direct, to learn but not to impose." Miller's journal recounts Barrett showing him a collection of the carved cypress figures, which by then numbered more than 30. Each represents a commitment made and kept, Barrett reportedly told the minister. They track an evolving understanding between myself and those who have chosen a different path. I do not delude myself that centuries of injustice can be undone by a few months of correction, but I believe I have established, if not trust, then, at least, a sustainable détente. The carvings, which Miller described in careful detail, included representations of buildings, boats, animals, and human figures in various postures. Barrett explained that each had specific meaning within the communication system that had evolved, with some indicating boundaries, others representing agreements about resources or movement, and still others serving as warnings or acknowledgments. The Reverend's account includes a disturbing incident that occurred during his stay at Belle Crescent. On his second night, Miller was awakened by unusual sounds from the direction of the swamp, what he described as a rhythmic percussion, neither entirely musical nor purely functional, accompanied by voices raised in a language or dialect unfamiliar to my ears. When he inquired about these sounds the following morning, Barrett acknowledged them with remarkable candor. "Those you hear are the free," Barrett reportedly said. "They have established communities in places where the swamp protects them from those who would return them to bondage. I maintain communication with them through intermediaries, and we have reached certain understandings. They know I am dismantling what my family built, though not as quickly as they might wish. In return, they refrain from more direct methods of hastening that process. The sounds you heard were part of their regular gatherings, a combination of religious observation, community decision-making, and what I can only describe as a form of historical preservation. They maintain traditions and languages that the plantation system has systematically attempted to eradicate, passing them from one generation to the next through methods that have remained hidden from those who would suppress them. Miller's journal expresses shock at Barrett's matter-of-fact description of what amounted to an autonomous community of formerly enslaved people existing beyond the reach of legal authority. More shocking still was Barrett's apparent acceptance of this situation, not as a temporary aberration to be corrected, but as a new reality to be accommodated. He spoke of this Solomon, whom I gather to be the leader of these swamp dwellers, with a respect bordering on reverence, Miller wrote. He described him as a man who has crafted freedom from the raw materials of oppression and seemed to regard their negotiations not as concessions to an inferior, but as treaties between equals. When I ventured to suggest that his position might be regarded by his peers as dangerously radical, he smiled with unexpected serenity and replied, "My peers, as you call them, are on the wrong side of history. They defend a system that cannot endure, not merely because it is morally indefensible, but because it generates the very forces that will eventually dismantle it. Solomon and those who follow him are not anomalies, but harbingers." The remaining months of 1836 saw the continued dismantling of Belle Crescent. According to property records, by December, Barrett had reduced his holdings to the main house and surrounding grounds, an area comprising less than a tenth of the original plantation. The sugar mill had been sold, the fields left fallow, and most of those formerly enslaved there had either been legally freed or had simply walked away, often, local rumors suggested, in the direction of Bayou Noir. The Attakapas Gazette, which had been publishing increasingly alarmed editorials about the situation at Belle Crescent, noted in its December issue that the plantation can no longer be properly described as a functioning agricultural enterprise, and that Barrett himself had become a figure of profound controversy, regarded by some as suffering from mental derangement and by others as engaged in deliberate sabotage of the economic and social fabric of the parish. The final chapter of Richard Barrett's story is documented in correspondence between Barrett and his solicitor in New Orleans, Laurent Dupré. These letters, discovered in the Dupré family papers donated to Tulane University in 1951, reveal Barrett's growing concern about his personal safety, not from those he had formerly enslaved or the mysterious denizens of the swamp, but from his fellow plantation owners. The letters outline Barrett's efforts to establish legal protections for the property he had transferred to Solomon Bayou, and to ensure that the manumission papers he had filed would withstand potential challenges after his departure or death. "I am under no illusions about how my actions are perceived," Barrett wrote to Dupré in January 1837. "What I view as necessary moral correction, they regard as dangerous betrayal of their collective interests. I have received threats, both veiled and explicit. Riders pass the property at night, voices raised in warning. I find myself in the peculiar position of being more secure at the edge of the swamp, in proximity to those I was raised to fear, than among my supposed peers. Yesterday a delegation of plantation owners arrived unannounced, led by Thomas Wilcox. Their ostensible purpose was to discuss community concerns, but their true intent was clear from the outset. They spoke of responsibility to shared interests, of the dangerous precedent set by my actions, of rumors that I had fallen under the influence of swamp dwellers. I received them with civility, but made no concessions. After their departure, I found a cypress sapling planted at the edge of the property, not one of Solomon's carvings, but a cruder message, its branches broken to form a noose-like configuration. Barrett's concerns were well-founded. On February 12, 1837, a fire broke out at the main house of the much-reduced Bell Crescent property. According to the sheriff's report, filed the following day, Barrett was seen fleeing the burning building but disappeared before reaching the road. A search of the surrounding area found no trace of him, and the prevailing assumption, recorded in the official report, was that he had perished in the fire. This conclusion was supported by statements from several neighboring plantation owners, who reported having seen Barrett enter the house earlier that evening and not emerge again until the fire was well established. This conclusion was challenged, however, by several unusual circumstances, noted but not emphasized in the official account. No remains were found in the ashes of the house. Most intriguingly, according to a deposition given by one of the remaining house servants and included in the case file, Barrett had spent the evening before the fire organizing a small satchel of essential items and documents, as though preparing for a journey long contemplated. The deposition also mentioned that Barrett had seemed unusually calm in the days preceding the fire, like a man who has made a decision of great consequence and found peace in its resolution. The Attakapas Gazette's account of the fire, published on February 15th, presented the event as a tragic accident, while subtly suggesting alternative possibilities. Barrett's personal papers and the collection of cypress figurines, known to have been kept in his study, were likewise missing. The destruction of the Bell Crescent main house, it reported, marks the final chapter in the decline of what was once among the most prosperous properties in the parish. Sources close to the investigation note certain unusual aspects of the incident, including the rapid spread of the fire and its apparent origin in multiple locations within the structure. These circumstances have led some to speculate that the fire may have been deliberately set, though whether by Mr. Barrett himself or by those who had expressed opposition to his unorthodox management practices remains a matter of conjecture. What can be stated with certainty is that with Barrett's presumed death, the extraordinary experiment he had undertaken comes to an inconclusive end. In the months following the fire, Bell Crescent effectively ceased to exist as an entity. The remaining property was eventually sold at auction to satisfy Barrett's outstanding debts, though the records indicate that the parcels previously transferred to Solomon Bayou remained separate from this settlement. Local accounts from this period suggest that the boundaries between settled land and swamp began to shift, with areas that had once been cultivated gradually returning to wetland as drainage systems fell into disrepair and natural water patterns reasserted themselves. The Attakapas Gazette noted with concern in its June 1837 issue that territories formerly under cultivation have been reclaimed by the swamp with uncommon rapidity, creating new channels of ingress for those who dwell within its borders and compromising the security of neighboring properties. The fate of Richard Barrett would have remained a historical mystery were it not for a remarkable discovery made in 1961 during an archaeological survey of previously unexplored regions of what had once been Bayou Noir. A team led by Dr. Eleanor Pruitt of Louisiana State University, investigating patterns of settlement among communities of escaped enslaved people in the antebellum South, uncovered the remains of what appeared to be a small but sophisticated settlement deep within the former swampland. The site, designated Bayou Noir Settlement A in the official archaeological record, was located on a naturally elevated area surrounded by what would have been seasonally flooded terrain in the 1830s, making it accessible only to those familiar with the complex network of waterways that characterized the region. Carbon dating of artifacts found at the site suggested occupation from approximately 1835 through the late 1850s. The settlement had been carefully planned, with structures arranged in a circular pattern around a central open area, and showed evidence of sophisticated water management techniques that utilized the natural flooding patterns of the swamp to provide irrigation during dry periods and drainage during wet ones. Among the items recovered were tools, cookware, weapons, and most significantly, a collection of carved cypress figurines nearly identical to those described in the Barrett Diaries and Reverend Miller's journal. These artifacts, preserved by the peculiar soil conditions of the site, provided tangible confirmation of the communication system that had evolved between the swamp dwellers and Barrett. Even more remarkable was a leather-bound ledger found sealed in a waterproof tin box buried beneath what appeared to have been the central structure of the settlement. The preservation of this document, despite the humid conditions and passage of time, was attributed by archaeologists to the exceptional care with which it had been stored. Wrapped in oiled cloth, placed within the tin container along with desiccating materials, and buried in a location selected for its elevated position and relative dryness. The ledger, which became known as the Bayou Noir Chronicle, contained entries spanning more than 20 years, written in several different hands. The early entries, dating from 1836 to 1839, described the establishment and growth of a community of formerly enslaved people in the heart of the swamp. These passages, scholarly analysis suggests, were written by someone with formal education, quite possibly Richard Barrett himself, though the author identifies himself only as the recorder. "Our numbers grow with each passing month," reads an entry from August 1837. "The routes have been established, the signals agreed upon. Those who seek sanctuary know to look for the markers, 3 broken reeds bound with cypress bark, placed where the water narrows. From there, guides bring them through passages that confound those who would follow. We have established 5 outposts around the central settlement, each with observers who maintain constant vigilance. The system developed by S for distinguishing friend from potential threat has proven remarkably effective. Unfamiliar boats are redirected through channels that lead away from our locations, while those who know the proper responses to the signals are guided safely in." Last week, 3 families arrived from the Thibodeau plantation, having followed the instructions passed through the network of communication that now extends throughout the parish. They spoke of increasing unrest among the planters, of expeditions being planned to penetrate deeper into the swamp. S received this information with characteristic calmness and immediately set in motion adjustments to our security arrangements. The ledger contains detailed descriptions of the community's organization, from food production and shelter construction to defense strategies and governance structures. It speaks of a man identified only as the founder, almost certainly the Solomon referenced in earlier documents, who established the initial settlement and developed the techniques used to navigate and manipulate the swamp environment. His methods are described with a mixture of practical detail and almost reverential appreciation, suggesting that even within the community he had established, Solomon occupied a position of unusual authority and respect. The founder teaches that the swamp is neither ally nor enemy, but a neutral power that can be understood and directed, one entry explains. He has studied its patterns for years, learning how water flows and gathers, where ground that appears solid will support weight, and where it will not, how to read the movements of animals and insects as indicators of changes to come. This knowledge, denied to those who view the swamp only as an obstacle or a resource to be exploited, has become our principal advantage. Today he demonstrated to the newer arrivals how the channels between the cypress stands can be temporarily blocked or diverted using materials gathered from the swamp itself, creating dry passages where there was water or flooding areas that were previously accessible. "The swamp remembers," he told them. "It holds the impression of what has been done to it and responds accordingly. Learn its language, and it will speak to you of approaching dangers and opportunities alike." The middle sections of the ledger, dating from 1840 to 1850, document the evolution of what the writer terms the Bayou Nation, a network of interconnected settlements hidden throughout the swamplands, maintaining contact through a system of messengers and signals. These passages make reference to similar communities established in swamplands across the South, suggesting communication and mutual support extending far beyond Louisiana. The writer describes a sophisticated governance structure that evolved over time, with leadership councils, communal resource management, and educational systems that preserved both practical knowledge and cultural traditions that the plantation system had attempted to suppress. The council met today to discuss the expansion proposed for the Eastern Settlement, reads an entry from 1844. S. advised caution, noting that increased activity in that direction might draw unwelcome attention, particularly with the new canal project bringing surveyors into previously inaccessible areas. It was decided to delay expansion until winter, when the higher water levels will provide additional security. In the meantime, we will reinforce the existing structures and continue training the newer arrivals in navigation and security protocols. The children's instruction continues, with the older members sharing knowledge of mathematics, reading, and writing, as well as the traditions brought from across the water. S. has emphasized the importance of maintaining these connections to the past while creating something new here, neither a recreation of what was lost nor a mirror of the society that surrounds us, but a different way of organizing human relations, built on principles of mutual support and shared decision-making. Of particular interest to historians are the ledger's accounts of interactions between the swamp communities and the surrounding plantation society. There were plantation owners who, like Richard Barrett, reached accommodations with the swamp dwellers, allowing for what one entry describes as a parallel system of liberty existing in the shadows of bondage. These arrangements varied from tacit non-interference to active cooperation, with certain plantation owners providing supplies, information, or legal assistance in exchange for protection from the more direct forms of resistance that had claimed the lives of Edwin Montgomery and William Barrett. According to these entries, the relationship was not characterized exclusively by conflict. We received word today from our contact at the Lejeune plantation, reads an entry from 1846. The owner has agreed to the terms proposed. He will continue the gradual process of manumission, releasing 3 individuals each month to make their way to us, if they choose, and will provide advance warning of any expeditions planned against the settlements. In return, his property remains secure from nocturnal visitations, and he receives a share of the medicinal plants gathered in the swamp which have proven effective against the fevers that afflict his family. It is a pragmatic arrangement rather than a moral conversion, but S. has always maintained that we must deal with the world as it is while working toward what it might become. Freedom, he said when the agreement was reported to the council, advances through many channels, some straight and clear, others winding and murky. We navigate all waters that flow in the direction we seek. The final entries in the ledger, dating from 1851 to 1857, adopt a more somber tone. They speak of increased pressure from authorities, more sophisticated attempts to penetrate the swamp, and the gradual abandonment of some settlements in favor of more remote locations. The writer describes debates within the council about whether to remain in the increasingly vulnerable swampland or to attempt relocation to territories further west, where federal authority was still establishing itself and new possibilities might exist. Throughout these discussions, Solomon, by then described as an elderly but still commanding figure, is portrayed as the advocate for movement rather than continued resistance in place. S. addressed the council today regarding the future of our settlements, reads an entry from 1855. He spoke with the clarity that has always characterized his most important communications, presenting the situation without embellishment. The drainage projects proceeding from New Orleans will eventually render the swamp more accessible, he explained. The new steam-powered boats can navigate channels that were previously impassable to larger vessels. The surveys conducted for the railroad will bring increased scrutiny to areas we have long considered secure. We have created something remarkable here, he told the assembled representatives. But we have always understood that nothing in the swamp is permanent. The water rises and falls, channels open and close, islands appear and disappear. We too must adapt to changing conditions. There are territories to the west where land can be claimed legally, where communities can establish themselves openly rather than in hiding. Some of us are too old to undertake such a journey, but for the younger generation, particularly the children born into freedom rather than escaping from bondage, a different future might be possible. The last dated entry in the ledger from November 1857 reads simply, "The founder has decided we must move again, further into the unclaimed territories. Those who wish to remain have his blessing, but he believes our future lies beyond the reach of those whose power depends on our subjugation. We leave at dawn. This record will be secured for those who come after, that they might understand what was built here and perhaps build something greater elsewhere. The swamp has taught us its central lesson. Adaptation is survival. What cannot bend must break. What cannot move must be overcome. We carry with us not merely possessions, but knowledge, not merely bodies, but possibilities. The journey continues. The fate of Solomon and those who followed him remains unknown. The archaeological evidence suggests that the settlement discovered by Dr. Pruitt's team was abandoned rather than destroyed, with many items carefully stored or deliberately hidden, as though those departing intended either to return or to leave a record for those who might come after them. Subsequent archaeological surveys have identified similar settlements throughout the swamplands of the Gulf Coast, suggesting that the Bayou Noir community was part of a larger network of resistance and autonomy that existed parallel to and within the interstices of the plantation system. The story of Solomon and the swamp communities he established gradually faded from official history, preserved primarily in local folklore, and the oral traditions of families descended from those who had been enslaved in the region. It was not until the discoveries of the 1950s and 1960s, the Barrett Diaries, the Bayou Noir Chronicle, and the archaeological evidence that historians began to reconstruct this remarkable narrative of resistance and adaptation. Even then, the story received relatively little attention compared to more conventional accounts of slave revolts and escapes, perhaps because it challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of resistance and the possibilities for autonomous community formation within the seemingly totalizing system of plantation slavery. What remains most elusive is Solomon himself. No verifiable image or detailed physical description of him has ever been found beyond the general references to his unusual height and commanding presence. The carved cypress figurines, dozens of which have now been recovered from various sites throughout what was once Bayou Noir, represent perhaps his most tangible legacy, small, portable symbols of communication and commitment that helped bind together a community existing beyond the boundaries of the society that sought to contain and control it. Analysis of these carvings has revealed a consistent hand in the earliest examples, suggesting they were indeed the work of a single individual, with later specimens showing variations in technique that indicate the skill was passed to others over time. In 1965, the last significant discovery related to the Bayou Noir settlements was made when a construction project near what had once been the edge of Belle Crescent Plantation uncovered a small metal box containing several documents and a single carved cypress figurine. Among the papers was a letter dated 1858 and signed simply R.B., almost certainly Richard Barrett. Addressed to no specific recipient, the letter reads in part, "I have lived now for more than 20 years in a world few would believe exists. What began as an act of atonement, inadequate and belated, has become a way of life I could never have imagined in my previous existence. I have learned that freedom is not merely the absence of chains, but the presence of possibility. In the community established by Solomon, I have witnessed the creation of something unprecedented, not a replica of the society that excluded and oppressed, but a new form of association based on principles I am still struggling to fully comprehend. Solomon himself remains an enigma even to those closest to him. He speaks rarely of his past, though it is known he was born in Africa and brought to these shores as a young man. What distinguishes him is not merely his formidable intelligence or his intimate knowledge of the swamp, but his ability to envision possibilities where others see only obstacles. He transformed what was meant as a place of exile and concealment into a domain of sovereignty. His method of resistance was not primarily through direct confrontation, though he proved capable of that when necessary, as my unfortunate relatives discovered, but through the creation of alternatives, through the patient accumulation of knowledge others deemed worthless, through the transformation of apparent constraints into unexpected advantages. As we prepare to depart for territories further west, I find myself reflecting on the journey that brought me here. I, who once presumed to own others, have learned what it means to belong to a community by choice rather than compulsion. I leave this record not as justification or absolution, but as testimony to a truth that persists, despite all efforts to deny it, that freedom, once glimpsed, creates its own geography, not on any map drawn by those in power, but in the spaces they cannot imagine to look. The swamp taught Solomon how to become invisible to those who hunted him, and he, in turn, taught others. But invisibility was never the ultimate goal, merely a tactical necessity in the creation of something that could eventually emerge into the light. The fate of Richard Barrett, like that of Solomon, remains unknown. No record of either man has been found in official documents after 1858. Local folklore in parts of East Texas and Oklahoma includes stories of settlements established in remote areas by groups led by a tall man who knew the ways of water and a white man who kept their history. But no archaeological evidence has yet confirmed these accounts. Some historians have suggested that Solomon and his followers may have eventually reached Mexico, where slavery had been abolished in 1829, or may have established communities in the less accessible regions of the Western Territories, blending over time into the complex social fabric of the frontier. What is certain is that the story of Solomon and the communities of Bayou Noir represents one of the most remarkable examples of resistance and alternative social formation in American history. A case where those designated as property not only claimed their freedom, but established autonomous societies that existed in parallel with the dominant culture, hidden in plain sight within landscapes deemed uninhabitable by those who failed to understand them. The systematic way in which Solomon transformed the very environmental conditions of the swamp into instruments of defense and liberation challenges conventional narratives of resistance, suggesting forms of agency and community building that operated outside the binary of submission and revolt. In the words of Dr. Eleanor Pruitt, whose discoveries helped bring this history to light, the swamp dwellers of Bayou Noir demonstrated that liberation need not wait for legal recognition. By reimagining their relationship to a landscape others feared and avoided, they created spaces of freedom in the very shadow of oppression. Their story challenges us to recognize that throughout history, official narratives have often flowed around islands of resistance like water around stones, visible only to those who know where and how to look. Solomon's genius lay not merely in his ability to navigate the swamp, but in his recognition that apparent obstacles could become resources, that the very marginality of the swampland made it a potential site for the creation of alternative social arrangements. In the interstices of the plantation system, in the spaces deemed worthless by the logic of agricultural capitalism, communities of resistance and autonomy took root and flourished, leaving traces that continue to emerge from the mud and water more than a century later. Today, the cypress swamps that once comprised Bayou Noir have largely been drained and developed, the waterways channeled and controlled. Yet in certain remote areas, local guides still point to oddly shaped trees or unusual formations of stones that they claim mark the old paths used by Solomon and his followers. Whether these are genuine remnants or later embellishments is impossible to determine with certainty. What remains unquestionable is that in these waters, now tamed and diminished, There once existed a geography of freedom, charted not on any official map, but in the shared knowledge of those who refused to accept the boundaries imposed upon them. And somewhere, perhaps, the descendants of those who followed Solomon into the swamp carry with them still the knowledge of how a man hunted became a hunter, and how a place of exile became a realm of possibility. The carved figurines, preserved in museum collections and occasionally still discovered in the marshy soil of what was once Bayou Noir, remain as tangible reminders of an extraordinary episode in the long struggle for freedom, small objects of profound significance, created by hands that transformed the very landscape that was meant to contain them into a domain of liberation.